On my wedding day, my parents chose a vacation over me. I remember standing at the entrance of the church, my bouquet trembling slightly in my hands, staring at two empty seats in the very first row. They were supposed to be filled by my mother, Linda Carter, and my father, Robert Carter. Instead, there was nothing but smooth white fabric and silence. I had told myself all morning that they would come, that they would walk in at the last minute, apologizing for the drama, smiling like none of it mattered. But the ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock sharp, and by 2:15, those seats were still empty. I checked my phone one last time before the music began. No missed calls. No heartfelt message. Just the final text my mother had sent me the night before. You're choosing a date over your sister. 3 months earlier, none of this felt possible. Daniel and I had booked the venue a year in advance, paid nearly $25,000 in deposits, and coordinated everything down to the last detail. The florist had measured the aisle twice. The caterer had confirmed the head count. Our wedding wasn't a spontaneous backyard barbecue. It was a carefully planned celebration with contracts and deadlines, and people flying in from 3 different states. Then my younger sister Madison decided to book a 2-week vacation to Italy with her boyfriend. When she realized the trip overlapped with my wedding weekend, she called my mother in tears. I wasn't on that call, but I heard about it soon enough. My mom came to my house 2 days later, sat at my kitchen table, and said gently, "Honey, can you move the date? Madison's been looking forward to this trip for months." I laughed at first because I thought she was joking. Move a wedding date? After the deposits? After the invitations had already been mailed? But she wasn't smiling. She leaned forward, her voice lowering. "Family comes first, Emily." I remember staring at her hands folded neatly on my table and thinking how strange it was that she couldn't see what she was asking. I explained about the contracts, about the guests who had booked flights, about Daniel's grandmother who had already arranged medical transport so she could attend. My mother listened, nodding, but her expression hardened. "Your sister hardly ever does anything for herself," she said. "Can't you compromise just this once?" Compromise. That word followed me for weeks. My father didn't argue with me directly. He rarely did. Instead, he sent short messages. "Think about the bigger picture. Is this worth hurting your relationship over?" Madison texted me a screenshot of her flight confirmation, as if that proved something. I tried to stay calm. I tried to be rational. I told them I loved them. I told them I hoped they would understand. But slowly, the tone shifted. Invitations to Sunday dinner stopped. Family group chats went quiet when I replied. And then, a week before the wedding, my mother said the sentence I never believed she would actually follow through on. "If you don't change it, don't expect us there." I thought it was a bluff. I truly did. Parents don't miss their daughter's wedding over a scheduling conflict. They don't choose sightseeing in Florence over walking their child down the aisle. But as I stood there in my white dress, watching guests turn and whisper when they noticed the empty seats, I realized this wasn't about Italy. It wasn't about plane tickets or hotel reservations. It was about something much older, something that had been quietly building for years. Madison had always been the one who needed more, who felt more, who demanded more. And I had always been the one expected to adjust. That afternoon, as the music swelled and Daniel squeezed my hand, I understood something with painful clarity. My parents hadn't missed my wedding because they couldn't attend. They missed it because I finally stopped moving my life around someone else's comfort. The reception hall looked exactly the way I had imagined it for months. Soft gold lights draped across the ceiling, round tables covered in ivory linens, centerpieces arranged with pale roses and eucalyptus that smelled faintly sweet every time someone walked past. On the surface, everything was perfect. Guests laughed near the open bar. My college friends waved me over for photos. Daniel's parents hugged me as if I had always been their daughter. And yet, every time I glanced toward the entrance, a small part of me expected to see my parents walking in late, offering some rushed explanation about traffic or a delayed flight. I kept telling myself that maybe they would surprise me. Maybe they would realize what they were about to miss. But as the hours passed, the only new arrivals were distant cousins and coworkers. My father did not step through those doors. My mother did not appear with tears in her eyes. Instead, sometime during dinner, my phone buzzed in my clutch. I should have ignored it. I knew it was them before I even looked. Still, I slipped away to a quiet corner near the coat check and opened the message. It was not an apology. It was a photo. Madison was standing on a balcony overlooking a wide stretch of blue water, the kind you see in travel magazines. Her hair was blowing in the wind. She was smiling at the camera as if nothing in the world was complicated. The caption read, "Finally in Florence. So grateful for family who understands priorities." My chest felt tight, but not in the way I expected. It was not sharp pain. It was something steadier, something colder. I stared at the timestamp. It had been posted less than 10 minutes earlier. While I was cutting my wedding cake, my family was publicly reinforcing the story that I had somehow been unreasonable. I did not cry. I did not throw my phone. I simply locked the screen and stood there for a moment, listening to the muffled sound of music from the ballroom. In that silence, memories began lining up in my mind like pieces of a pattern I had ignored for years. When I was 16 and had made varsity on the soccer team, my parents missed my first home game because Madison had a piano recital across town. When I graduated from college, my father left the reception early because Madison felt anxious about an exam the next morning. Even the weekend Daniel proposed, my mother had called to ask if I could postpone announcing it publicly because Madison had just gone through a breakup and it would be too much for her. I had always told myself it was temporary, that families go through phases, that one day things would balance out. But standing there in my wedding dress, holding a phone that proved exactly where my parents had chosen to be, I understood that this was not a phase. It was a pattern. It had simply reached its most visible moment. When I walked back into the reception, Daniel looked at me carefully, searching my face for signs of distress. I smiled and took his hand. "They are not coming," I said quietly. He nodded once, as if he had already accepted that reality long before I did. We returned to the dance floor. We greeted our guests. We thanked people for traveling hundreds of miles to celebrate with us. And with every hug from someone who chose to show up, I felt something shift inside me. It was subtle but permanent. The absence of my parents no longer felt like an accident. It felt like information. Information about who they were when forced to choose. Information about where I stood in their hierarchy of priorities. By the time the last song played and the hall began to empty, I was no longer waiting for the doors to open. I was no longer checking my phone. I was simply taking mental note of the empty spaces they had left behind, not just in the first row of the ceremony, but in the structure of our relationship itself. The morning after the wedding, the house felt unusually quiet, as if the walls themselves were adjusting to a new reality. Daniel had already left for work, giving me a gentle kiss on the forehead before he walked out the door, and I stood alone in our kitchen staring at a stack of unopened cards and carefully wrapped gifts that we had brought home the night before. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines across the hardwood floor, and for a brief moment everything looked peaceful. Then my phone began to vibrate against the countertop. It was my mother. I let it ring. A minute later, a message appeared instead. "I hope you enjoyed your big day. We are disappointed it had to come to this." I read the sentence twice, trying to understand how disappointment had somehow become her claim. There was no acknowledgement of absence, no apology for the empty seats, just a subtle repositioning of blame, as if the entire outcome had been something I orchestrated. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the small table by the window, replaying the past few months with sharper clarity than I had ever allowed myself before. When Madison first mentioned her vacation, I had congratulated her. I had even offered to help her find a dress for my wedding that would match the Italian summer heat. There had been no hostility in my voice, no resentment. I had assumed she would adjust her travel plans the way most people would when a sibling's wedding fell on the same weekend. Instead, my mother had called a family meeting at their house, sitting across from me on the living room couch with that careful expression she used whenever she believed she was being reasonable. "You know how sensitive Madison is," she had said. "She has been looking forward to this trip for a long time." My father had remained in his recliner, hands folded, nodding occasionally, but never challenging the narrative. I remember asking one simple question. Why is her vacation more important than my wedding? The silence that followed had been heavy, not because they did not have an answer, but because the answer was obvious and uncomfortable. Over the next few weeks, the pressure became quieter but more pointed. My mother would call and remind me how hard Madison had been working. My father would mention that family harmony mattered more than any single event. Even Madison herself sent me a message that read, "If you loved me, you would understand." That sentence lingered long after the conversation ended. If you love me. As if love was measured by how much I was willing to give up. As if my commitment to Daniel, the contracts we had signed, the guests who had booked flights and hotel rooms, were all negotiable in the face of her preference. Sitting there in my kitchen, I realized something that felt both painful and clarifying. This had never been about the logistics. It had been a test. A final measurement of whether I would once again rearrange my life to preserve Madison's comfort. When I finally replied to my mother's message, my hands were steady. You made your choice, I wrote. So did I. There was no anger in my tone. No dramatic accusation. Just a statement of fact. A few minutes later, my father sent a shorter message. We hope you will not hold this against us forever. I stared at the word forever and felt a strange calm settle over me. They were worried about time. About consequences that might extend beyond a single missed ceremony. For the first time, I was not scrambling to repair the damage. I was not offering reassurance. I was simply observing. And in that quiet observation, I understood that something fundamental had shifted. Not just between us, but within me. The absence at my wedding was no longer a wound that needed tending. It was evidence. Evidence of a dynamic that I had finally stopped pretending was balanced. In the weeks that followed, the silence between us stretched in a way that felt deliberate. My parents did not call to ask how married life was going. They did not ask if Daniel and I had settled back into our routines or whether the honeymoon had been restful. Instead, the first real conversation came nearly 3 weeks later, when my mother invited me to lunch as if nothing unusual had happened. The restaurant she chose was the same small Italian place we had gone to for birthdays growing up, red checkered tablecloths and framed photographs of the Amalfi Coast lining the walls. I almost laughed at the irony. When I walked in, she stood up and hugged me lightly, the kind of hug you give a distant relative. My father was already seated, studying the menu. We ordered iced tea. We discussed traffic. We talked about the weather. It was as if my wedding day had been an ordinary Saturday that required no mention. Finally, I asked the question directly. Do you regret not coming? My mother set her glass down carefully before answering. Emily, we did not want it to come to that. But you forced us into a corner. Forced. The word echoed in my mind. I asked her how I had forced them. She explained, calmly and confidently, that by refusing to move the date, I had chosen rigidity over family unity. She said Madison had felt dismissed. She said they could not reward behavior that ignored the feelings of others. My father nodded quietly beside her, adding that sometimes parents have to make difficult decisions to teach perspective. I listened without interrupting. I noticed how smoothly the narrative had been rewritten. In their version, I was not the daughter who had planned a wedding a year in advance. I was the stubborn sibling who valued convenience over connection. I asked whether they had considered that I might feel dismissed as well. My mother looked genuinely puzzled, as if the thought had not occurred to her. You are stronger, she said. You have always been the independent one. There it was again, the quiet justification. Because I handled disappointment without crying, because I rarely demanded attention, I had been assigned the role of the one who could absorb more. Madison needed protection. I needed perspective. I asked them one final question. If Madison gets married one day and I schedule a trip during her ceremony, would you expect her to move it for me? My father shifted in his chair. My mother did not answer immediately. After a long pause, she said, That is different. I did not press further. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply nodded and reached for my purse. As I stood to leave, I realized something important. They were not confused about what they had done. They were convinced it was justified. That clarity removed the last thread of doubt I had been holding on to. On the drive home, I felt neither anger nor tears. I felt adjustment, a recalibration of expectations. For years, I had believed that if I explained myself clearly enough, if I remained patient enough, fairness would eventually follow. But fairness was not the operating principle of our family. Preference was. And preference had always tilted in the same direction. That afternoon, I stopped trying to convince them that my wedding mattered. It had mattered to the people who showed up. It had mattered to Daniel. It had mattered to me. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Over the next few months, I did not make any dramatic announcements about distance or boundaries. I simply adjusted my availability. When my mother called on a Tuesday afternoon to ask whether Daniel and I could host Thanksgiving because Madison might be too busy this year, I told her calmly that we had already made plans. That was true. We had decided to spend the holiday with Daniel's parents, who had shown up early to help set up chairs at our reception and stayed late to stack plates. My mother paused for a moment before replying. "You have never missed Thanksgiving at home." I answered gently. "There is a first time for everything." The silence that followed felt familiar, but this time it did not intimidate me. A week later, Madison sent me a message asking if I could help her review a lease agreement for a new apartment. In the past, I would have rearranged my evening to sit with her, highlighting clauses and explaining fine print. Instead, I responded that I was tied up with work and suggested she consult a professional. Her reply was short. "You have changed." I read those words carefully. Perhaps I had. Or perhaps I had simply stopped overcompensating. At Christmas, my parents hosted their usual dinner. They invited us, of course, and I chose to attend. I wore a simple green dress and brought a dessert. I greeted relatives with warmth. I asked about their children, their jobs, their travel plans. From the outside, nothing appeared fractured. But inside, I was observing. I noticed how quickly my mother rushed to refill Madison's glass. I noticed how my father laughed more loudly at her stories. I also noticed something new. When an aunt asked casually, "So, Robert, how was the wedding? We missed you in the photos." My father's smile tightened. He cleared his throat and said, "There were scheduling complications." He did not elaborate. He did not defend the choice. He simply redirected the conversation. It was subtle, but it was there. A flicker of discomfort. Later that evening, my mother pulled me aside near the hallway. "You seem distant," she said quietly. I met her eyes and answered, "I am adjusting." She asked what that meant. I told her that I no longer expected everyone to prioritize me, but I would no longer prioritize people who did not show up for me either. I did not accuse her. I did not raise my voice. I simply stated it as a principle. She looked at me as if she were trying to measure how serious I was. For years, I had been the one who smoothed tension, who reassured, who absorbed imbalance to keep peace intact. Now I was calm without offering comfort. That shift unsettled her more than any argument would have. As Daniel and I drove home that night, he reached over and squeezed my hand. "You handled that well," he said. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights and realized that the ache I had carried since the ceremony was no longer sharp. It had transformed into clarity. I was not cutting my parents out of my life. I was simply repositioning them. They were no longer the center of my emotional decision-making. They were relatives, not authorities. That distinction changed everything. Over time, invitations continued. Requests continued. But each response from me was measured against one simple question. Would they have shown up for me the way they expected me to show up for them? If the answer was no, I declined without guilt. For the first time in my adult life, my sense of worth was not tethered to how much I could bend. It was grounded in the fact that I no longer would. By early spring, nearly 6 months after the wedding, the rhythm of my relationship with my parents had settled into something quieter and more distant. We spoke occasionally. We exchanged polite messages about birthdays and minor updates. But the automatic closeness that once defined us had dissolved. One Saturday afternoon, my father called unexpectedly. His voice sounded measured, almost careful. He asked whether Daniel and I could come by the house, because there was something important to discuss. I agreed without hesitation, though I sensed the weight behind his tone. When we arrived, my mother had already set out coffee and a plate of cookies, as if hospitality could cushion whatever conversation was coming. We sat in the same living room where they had once asked me to move my wedding date. My father cleared his throat and explained that Madison had recently accepted a new job offer in another state. It was an exciting opportunity, he said, but she was anxious about relocating. They were considering helping her with the down payment on a condominium. He paused, then added, "We wanted to be transparent with you." The word transparent lingered in the air. I listened quietly as my mother explained that assisting Madison financially might affect future family plans, including how they structured their estate. She emphasized that it was not favoritism, just support during a transition. I noticed how often she repeated that phrase. Support during a transition. I asked whether they had ever considered offering similar support to Daniel and me when we purchased our home the previous year. My father hesitated. My mother looked down at her cup. "You both seemed stable," she said finally. "We did not think you needed it." There was no malice in her voice. Only certainty. That same certainty that had justified their absence months earlier. I felt the familiar urge to explain, to remind them that stability does not eliminate the value of support. But I stopped myself. I had learned that clarity does not always change perception. Instead, I nodded and said, "I appreciate the honesty." Daniel remained calm beside me, his presence steady and reassuring. On the drive home, I did not feel anger. I felt confirmation. The pattern was consistent. Madison's needs were urgent and visible. Mine were assumed and invisible. That evening, I opened my laptop and reviewed our financial plans. Daniel and I had built our life carefully, budgeting for our mortgage, planning for retirement, setting aside emergency savings. We had done it without expectation of help. And for the first time, I felt grateful for that independence. It meant our future was not entangled with conditional generosity. A week later, my mother called again, this time with a softer tone. She mentioned that Madison was overwhelmed by the moving process and asked whether I could take a few days off work to help her pack. I thought about the hours I had once spent rearranging my schedule to accommodate similar requests. I thought about the empty seats in the front row of the church. Then I answered gently, "I will not be available, but I hope everything goes smoothly." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You are pulling away," she said quietly. I considered her words. "I am choosing balance," I replied. After I ended the call, I stood in our living room and looked around at the life Daniel and I were building. The framed wedding photo on the mantel showed us smiling, surrounded by people who had shown up. It did not show the empty chairs, but I remembered them, not as a source of pain anymore, but as a turning point. The moment I understood that love offered conditionally is not love that can anchor you. And since that realization, I had stopped trying to anchor myself to it. A few weeks after Madison moved into her new condominium, my parents organized a small housewarming gathering for her and invited the extended family. I learned about it through a group message that included photos of freshly painted walls, a new sectional sofa, and a kitchen island decorated with a bowl of lemons. The caption read, "So proud of our girl starting this new chapter." There was no mention of the financial assistance that had made that chapter possible, but I did not need confirmation. It was written between the lines. Daniel asked whether I wanted to attend the gathering. I thought about it carefully. In the past, I would have shown up early with a gift, helped arrange chairs, stayed late to wash dishes. This time, I chose to send a simple congratulations card instead. My mother called that evening, her voice strained. "People are asking where you are," she said. I answered honestly, "I have other commitments." There was a pause before she replied, "It would mean a lot to your sister." I considered that sentence. For years, meaning a lot to Madison had required me to adjust, to sacrifice, to absorb. I asked gently, "Would it have meant a lot to you to attend my ceremony?" Silence filled the line. It was not angry. It was heavy. My mother shifted the topic quickly, mentioning how beautiful the city skyline looked from Madison's balcony. When the call ended, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only equilibrium. A few days later, my father sent a message asking if we could meet for lunch, just the two of us. We chose a quiet diner near his office. He looked older than I remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, his posture slightly curved. After ordering coffee, he spoke plainly. "Your mother feels like she is losing you." I listened without interrupting. He continued, explaining that the distance worried her, that she did not understand how things had escalated so quickly. I took a slow breath and answered with care. "Nothing escalated quickly. It has been gradual. I just stopped ignoring it." He looked down at his hands. I told him that I was not cutting them out of my life. I was simply matching effort with effort. When they prioritized Madison, I respected their choice. But I would no longer compete for attention that had already been assigned elsewhere. My father nodded slowly, as if processing something uncomfortable but undeniable. Before we left, he asked whether there was a way to repair what had been damaged. I thought about that question for a long moment. Repair requires acknowledgement, I said. Not justification, not rewriting, just acknowledgement. He did not promise anything. He simply paid the check and walked me to my car. That evening, Daniel and I sat on our back porch watching the sun set behind the row of maple trees lining our street. The air was cool, the kind of early summer breeze that carries the scent of cut grass. I realized that for the first time, I was not waiting for validation from my parents to feel settled. The foundation of my life no longer depended on their approval. It rested on mutual respect, on consistency, on people who chose to show up without negotiation. The imbalance that had once shaped every family interaction was now visible to me in plain daylight. And once something is clearly seen, it cannot be unseen. I was no longer trying to correct the past. I was simply building a future where my worth did not fluctuate based on someone else's preference. It was nearly a year after the ceremony when the conversation finally shifted in a way I had not anticipated. Daniel and I were hosting a small dinner at our house, just a few close friends, when my phone vibrated with a call from my mother. I stepped into the hallway to answer it, keeping my voice low so the laughter from the dining room would not carry into the receiver. Her tone was different from before, softer, less certain. She asked how I was doing, how work had been, how married life felt now that the first year was almost complete. The questions sounded ordinary, but beneath them was something tentative. After a few minutes of small talk, she said quietly, "Your father and I have been thinking about everything that happened." I did not interrupt. I had learned that silence often revealed more than argument. She continued, explaining that a distant relative had recently made a comment at another family gathering about missing our wedding and how unfortunate it was that my parents had not attended. She said it made her uncomfortable. She said it made her reflect. I listened to the way she framed it. Not regret, not remorse. Reflection prompted by outside perception. I asked gently, "What have you concluded?" There was a pause long enough that I could hear her breathing. "Maybe we were too rigid," she admitted. It was the closest she had come to acknowledgement. I did not rush to reassure her. I did not say it was fine or that it was in the past. I simply said, "It mattered to me." The simplicity of that sentence felt stronger than any detailed explanation I could have offered. She told me they had felt cornered, that they had believed setting a firm boundary would teach me something about compromise. I asked what lesson they believed I had learned. She did not answer directly. Instead, she said, "We do not want distance to become permanent." I looked back toward the dining room where Daniel was pouring wine for our guests, where warmth and ease filled the space without effort. "Distance did not appear overnight," I said calmly. "It grew from choices." For the first time, she did not challenge that statement. She asked whether we could all sit down together soon and talk openly, without defensiveness. I agreed, not out of obligation, but because I no longer feared the outcome. A week later, we met at their house again. This time, Madison was present. She looked slightly uncomfortable, shifting in her seat as my parents spoke. My father acknowledged that missing the ceremony had hurt me more than they had anticipated. My mother admitted that they had prioritized Madison's feelings without fully considering mine. It was not a dramatic apology. It was measured and imperfect, but it was spoken. Madison added quietly that she had not expected them to choose her trip over my day and that she had assumed they would still attend. Whether that was entirely true, I could not say. What mattered was that the narrative had finally shifted from justification to acknowledgement. I told them that I did not need grand gestures. I needed consistency. I needed future choices to reflect equal regard. I did not demand promises. I simply set the standard. As Daniel and I drove home afterward, I felt something settle inside me. Forgiveness, I realized, is not the same as forgetting. It is a decision to move forward without erasing what happened. The empty seats would always be part of our story, but they no longer defined my sense of worth. They had revealed a dynamic. And once revealed, that dynamic could either continue unchanged or evolve. For the first time, the possibility of evolution felt real. 2 years have passed since the afternoon I stood at the entrance of the church and realized that absence can speak louder than presence. Time has not erased that moment, but it has placed it in perspective. Daniel and I have built routines that feel steady and intentional. We host dinners with friends who arrive on time. We take weekend road trips without negotiating our plans around anyone else's preferences. We celebrate milestones with people who show up because they want to, not because they are trying to manage appearances. My parents are still part of my life, but in a way that is clearer and more balanced. They call more often now. They ask direct questions and listen longer than they used to. When Madison announced her engagement last spring, my mother mentioned the date carefully, almost cautiously, as if measuring how I might respond. I congratulated her sincerely. I asked about the venue and the guest list. There was no bitterness in my voice, only awareness. A few weeks later, my father asked whether I would be willing to attend a planning dinner for Madison's ceremony. I agreed, but I did so on my own terms. I arrived at the restaurant on time. I contributed ideas when asked. And when the conversation drifted toward potential scheduling conflicts, I said calmly, "Whatever date you choose, make sure it works for you. Do not expect anyone else to rearrange their life." The table fell quiet for a second. Not tense, just reflective. My mother nodded slowly. "We understand," she said. And I believe that she did. The difference now is not dramatic. It is subtle. It is in the way my parents check the calendar before committing to something that affects me. It is in the way my father asks about Daniel's work with genuine interest. It is in the way my mother no longer assumes that I will absorb inconvenience without acknowledgement. Change did not come from confrontation. It came from consequence. From my quiet refusal to continue a pattern that diminished me. Sometimes I think about those 2 empty seats and what they represented. They were not just a missed ceremony. They were a line drawn in my own understanding of self-respect. Before that day, I believed love required constant flexibility. I believed harmony was preserved by being the reasonable one. Now I understand that love without reciprocity becomes imbalance, and imbalance eventually becomes distance. The distance we experienced forced clarity, and clarity forced growth. Last month, my parents came to our house for dinner. We set the table with simple white plates and lit a few candles. When they arrived, my mother hugged me longer than usual. My father complimented the garden Daniel had planted along the fence. During dessert, my mother looked at me and said quietly, "We are glad we are here." It was a small sentence, but it carried weight. I met her eyes and answered, "So am I." Not because everything is perfect, not because the past disappeared, but because the future now feels intentional rather than assumed. The lesson I carried forward was not about revenge or proving a point. It was about understanding that showing up is a choice. And once I realized that, I stopped begging for it. I started expecting it. And in doing so, I built a life where the people who sit in the front row do so because they value being there.